Three funeral home directors were having their monthly gathering at a local establishment, and after a couple of beverages, the conversation took a philosophical turn. What would you like them to say about you as they pass by your casket at your funeral? They asked one another. The first funeral home director, without a pause, immediately chimed in that he loved his family. That's what I'd want them to say about me, that I loved my family. The second one thought for a moment before saying her thoughts that I served the community, that I was committed to service with everyone who came to me. And the third one took a long, careful, thoughtful sip from his beverage before saying, as they passed by my body, I'd want them to say, "Look, he's moving." All the main events in Jesus' life, from the Annunciation to the Ascension, are directly described in the Gospels, except for one thing: the resurrection. The most important event of all is not described in Scriptures. We see it indirectly through effects, results, consequences, but not the moment, not the instant of resurrection, the first, "Look, he's moving." Enter Christian artists who, through the century, have produced their own depictions of that resurrection moment, ending up offering two very different images of the resurrection. The first is what might be called the individual resurrection, and with Jesus coming out of the tomb completely alone, rising up into the air. The other is what might be called the universal resurrection tradition, with Jesus rising up, but also reaching back to grasp the hands of others, specifically Adam and Eve most often, representatives of the whole humanity, so that they and we might rise with him. Therefore, if we have been buried with him by baptism into death, so just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, we too might walk in newness of life. That's how Paul describes our deep connection to Christ's resurrection in our epistle reading this morning. Paul clearly was a universalist in his understanding of the power and effect of the resurrection. It wasn't just for Christ, it was for us as well. All of this is by way of posing you a question. How are you being raised on this Easter morning? How is Easter Sunday getting you moving again? How is Jesus Christ reaching back to pull you up, out, and away from the powers of death and despair so that you too can come back to life again? Here's the example I want us to contemplate this Easter morning. One of those people in the first part of our gospel reading who was suddenly reanimated and freed from her or his tomb as described by Matthew. Have you ever noticed those verses from chapter 27 before? At the moment of Jesus' death, the earth shudders in shame, the sky darkens in sorrow, the curtain of the temple is torn asunder and falls to the ground. And one more thing, at Jesus' death, there's a kind of initial spasm of resurrection power that's released, that leaks out and opens some tombs and calls some dead folks back to life. I want us to imagine this morning that we are one of those dead ones, suddenly awakened to wander through the streets of Jerusalem. What the heck just happened? Last thing I knew, I was dead. People were crying as they walked by my casket. When was the last time you were brought back to life? When you were truly surprised, shocked by good fortune, moved by the miraculous, suddenly reanimated from the deadly sameness of daily life? Were you holding a new baby in your arms? Did you fall in love as if you were struck by a thunderbolt? Did someone recognize something good about you and give you a compliment that you were never expecting? Did the power of forgiveness sweep through you in a way it never has before? Did you discover your calling? Did you have a close call? did it suddenly occur to you that you were incredibly blessed? So there I was in 8th grade, tooling along the road on my pride and joy, my 10-speed Peugeot bicycle. I had saved up my allowance. I had caddied at the local country club. I had done extra jobs around the house and around the neighborhood, and I had socked it away to buy my bike. It was my first big purchase in life, and it was the fruit of lots of trips to the bike store, repeated careful readings of everybody's bike book, and countless conversations with my best friend, who, by the way, bought a Raleigh, clearly inferior to my marvelous Peugeot, with all of its je ne sais quoi. So there I was, in the 8th grade, speeding down the road on a beautiful spring day in the days before any of us wore bike helmets, foreshadowing, thinking about somebody else, looking at something that had caught my eye, God knows what. Suddenly, my bike crashed into a parked car. Actually, I didn't even see it happen. I was riding along. Next thing I knew, I was tumbling through the air in a full flip. I landed on my feet, perfectly in stride and running as fast as I could. I mean, 1 minute I'm this, and the next minute I'm this. When I finally stopped and looked back, that's when I noticed that my bike had crashed. But that moment, flipping through the air, landing in a dead run, was as alive as I have ever been in my life. So they left the tomb quickly with fear and great joy and ran to tell his disciples. That was it. Exactly. With fear and great joy, this strange and marvelous adrenaline-fueled mixture. That's how I felt, just like the women who encountered the angel at the empty tomb felt. Do you think that's how those reanimated folks in Jerusalem felt? Fear and great joy. When have you felt like that? Back in 1990, they made a movie out of Dr. Oliver Sacks' book, Awakenings. It's a remarkable story that you've probably heard of, an account of a group of patients who encountered sleeping sickness during the great epidemic just after World War I. These men and women were frozen in a decade-long sleep and given up as hopeless when Dr. Sacks gave them the then new drug L-Dopa, which had an astonishing, explosive, awakening effect. Even if the effect was not long-term, the spiritual healing and personal transformations that took place in these patients and their families during their awakenings were remarkable. Dan Cohen recently wrote about an experience he had with his father, who is suffering from dementia. His father's condition had worsened to the point that he barely spoke, he had no short-term memory, needed assistance in taking care of his basic bodily needs. He still recognized his family and was in good enough and even spirits that they could take him out to movies and to restaurants, but then his dementia worsened. He was hospitalized with pneumonia for 10 days. He became fully incontinent, agitated, cried out often in pain without any apparent reason. He could no longer go out to lunch or to movies. Then he had a second bout of pneumonia and hypertension. Dan's father was hospitalized again and was treated with a high dose of steroids and antibiotics. After about 24 hours of this treatment, he began to awake. This is how Dan Cohen describes it. My father turned to me and said, "How are you doing?" The importance of what he said hadn't dawned on me immediately because my father no longer initiated conversations or spoke in full sentences. He hadn't asked about my own life or well-being for years. I responded, "I'm okay, Dad." Then he said, "You know I love you very much." He then asked, "What happened to me?" My father's awakening continued for 2 days. Among the things we were able to experience, my father told my brother it was great to have him as a son like him and that he was grateful for his children and grandchildren. He also asked my sister about her beloved dog, which she had adopted while he was in the early stages of dementia. Perhaps the most remarkable was his interaction with my mom, who lives with him every day and clearly suffers the most from seeing my dad's worsening condition. At one point, he told my mom that she was the love of my life. Maybe equally as amazing was when he asked Mom for some money so he could tip the nurses and aides who had been so kind to him. His father's awakening was temporary. He reverted to his full-blown dementia in just a few days. You can imagine that his family's emotions were decidedly mixed. Delighted that they had had this time with their husband and father when he was alert, sad that the time didn't last, and confused in trying to understand how and why this awakening had happened. Was it medical? Having to do with the high dose of steroids? Was it miraculous? The healing hand of God moving in a mysterious way? Was it simply personal? The strong-willed father's way of sending the family a final message of love? So they left the tomb quickly with fear and great joy and ran to tell his disciples. I want to remind you this morning that our Easter Sunday only begins with the celebration of Christ's resurrection. What we ultimately celebrate is our resurrection. Christ reaching back, taking our hands, lifting us up with him. What we celebrate is both heavenly good news and the power of an earthly awakening, if only we are willing to live our lives with that amazing mixture of fear and great joy. I know you get weary with the world, with its persistent lies and hypocrisy and violence. I know you get beaten down with injustice that infects us like a disease that spreads and hides and resurfaces anew. I know you get filled with deep and buried dread over concern for the earth and the future of life on this planet. I know you are sorrowful over those who have died, the love you have lost, and the futures you had planned only to have them taken away. Better to live without hope, we think. Better to live without illusions and plans. Better to join the living dead who have given up on faith and given in to apathy. But I am here to tell you that Jesus is calling. Christ is reaching back. God is acting in resurrection power to wake us up, to call us out of our tombs and back to life, to fill us with fear and great joy, the harrowing, thrilling adventure of following Christ's way in the world. God is calling you to wake up, shake off your slumber and sloth, your dread and despair, and stumble on ahead, leaving the past behind you like a broken bicycle on the side of the road. God is calling you to wake up and speak the words you say too seldom. I love you. I appreciate you. I forgive you. Wake up and dare to dream of better days for the world, of justice and peace, of having enough to sustain this planet and living in harmony with all. Wake up and live the daily prayer of Jesus on earth as it is in heaven, and do those things big and small that will be a heavenly blessing on those around you. I know it's scary, but what if we let ourselves fear again? What if we open up our hearts to joy once more? What if we left behind our deadened souls and let our spirits soar once more? What if, when Christ was raised, you were raised too?